Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and do a little introduction of Chelsea. And then I have a few just like intro slides because Chelsea is going to be, Dr. Haramia is going to be talking about the ethics of METI. And I know we have some of our interns from the Breakthrough Listen group with us today. And I just wanted to like do a short, maybe 3-minute intro on like what METI is and who's done it over time, because it's not the focus of Dr. Haramia's talk. So before we do that, I am DJing 2 monitors right now and I'm not doing a great job. So give me 1 second. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so our guest speaker today is Dr. Chelsea Haramia. And Chelsea Haramia is an assistant professor of philosophy at Spring Hill College. She has published in the area of ethics, bioethics, animal ethics, aesthetics, and space ethics. Her current work engages in ethical and meta-ethical analysis of space exploration and the search for intelligent life in particular. And I'm going to copy paste her webpage and put it in the chat. Thanks to Andrew for posting the Astronomy Cartoons Facebook group. And before I hand over the mic to Dr. Haramia, I'm going to do just like, I found some old slides of some history of METI that I'm just going to throw at you for like 3 minutes, and then I'll pass the baton to Chelsea. So this should be a really fun subject. We talk a lot about SETI. We've had talks on the history of SETI, and I thought that this would be good to branch out just a little bit and bring in some new perspectives. So again, gonna DJ the shared screen and see where I go. Give me 1 second. And if you can, mute your mics. And let's see here, share screen. Okay, so just wanted to give people a brief history of METI. This started in 1962 with the Morse message, and here's a list. This is not a complete list. Again, I mentioned this was like, I found an old slide deck that I had previously done a talk on. But we've had these messages where these are intentional messages with information about the human race sent into the cosmos using powerful radio telescopes, and some of them more targeted than others, and just wanted to kind of let people know that this is a thing that's happened and is still happening. And oops, just some images of what some of these messages look like. So 1962 was the Morse message. The Arecibo message was a famous one you probably all have heard of, and sent in 1974 to a globular cluster, which was more ceremonial instead of more targeted. This is what the Arecibo message looks like. Then we had the cosmic call in 1999 and 2003, and that's what this looked like. The teenage message in 2001. Again, I'm just wanted to go through this really fast. Sent by a Russian radio astronomer to 6 nearby sun-like stars in 2001. This is what that message looked like. A message from Earth that was sent to an exoplanet. So it's becoming, these messages are trending towards being more focused and more sent to like exoplanets before perhaps not. Across the universe was beamed in the direction of Polaris in 2008, more of as a ceremony of the 50th anniversary of NASA and the 45th anniversary of the Deep Space Network. And recently, I think this was 2018, a Sonar D, I think was a product of like a Spanish concert. There was some concert that they beamed up some information, if I have that correct. And Hello from Earth was in 2009. I think I might have switched those slides. But anyway, there's been trends in messaging that over time they've been getting more dense with information. There's now METI International, who sent a message recently, I think in the last 2 years. And there's some ethical considerations and when we talk about METI and SETI. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass the baton to our speaker, Dr. Chelsea Haramia. And I think I've made you co-host, so go ahead and.
Great. Okay, I'm going to just start off sharing my screen here, make sure I do that correctly. We're going to hit. There we go. I'm good. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to thank you all. I'm excited to be able to talk with you today and to thank Julia for hosting, but also to thank Julia for the kind of invaluable consultation and feedback she's given, because she's been working with me on some of this stuff. And in fact, there is a volume coming out on the ethics of astrobiology, and we have a chapter forthcoming in that. And so some of the stuff that you'll see today is going to show up in that chapter as well. So thank you. And I'm here to talk about active versus passive searches and to provide an ethical assessment of those. And Julia, thank you for giving us the nice kind of background on METI. And METI is what I have in mind, is one of the things I have in mind when talking about active searches. So let's start by distinguishing between these two modes of search, right? So active searches, the key feature of these searches is that they are announcing our presence to others. And these include projects like METI. They're often called active SETI projects. And I'm going to contrast these with passive searches. Passive searches, the key feature of these are that they are scanning for the presence of others. And this is largely a lot of what SETI has been doing over the decades. And I'm going to argue that active and passive searches are not ethically identical. So they have some unique features, and the appropriate ethical analysis of the project of searching for intelligent life is going to depend in part on how each search is carried out. Okay, so here we have the differences, and I think that to a lot of people at first glance, the most obvious seeming ethical difference between active and passive searches is perhaps a difference in risk, right? I don't think anyone claims that passive searches are risk-free, but I think it does seem to a lot of people that it's inherently riskier to announce our presence than it is to merely passively attempt to detect the presence of others. So what I want to start off doing is considering this claim that it's inherently riskier to actively announce our presence than it is to passively attempt to detect the presence of others. And I, as Julie mentioned, am a philosopher. And so what I'm going to be going through is claims and arguments and reasoning in favor of certain conclusions, but also looking through responses and challenges to those and just seeing where we land ethically. Okay, so let's consider this claim. A lot of people might think, hey, this seems a little bit riskier, actively announcing, actively searching. Here I'm going to bring in someone who thinks it's not, who's going to challenge this idea. So here's Adam Corbett's quoting. He's a lawyer who specializes in emerging issues and risk and technology and science policy. And he's going to challenge that claim that we just saw on the last slide. So he says, quote, "We have no way of knowing if ETI's position toward humans or other extant civilizations would be one of egoism, say selfishness or even predation, ethical altruism, or something in between, resembling a recognition of equality between races or civilizations." So given this vacuum of knowledge, right, given our pretty total ignorance, right, we do not currently have reason to believe that active SETI is inherently risky, presenting a clear and present danger to the human race. So, okay, Corbett's is going to reject that initial claim, the claim that it's inherently riskier to actively search than to passively scan the skies for the presence of others. Let's think about this. One important response to consider, response to Corbett's there, is the fact that we should not be conflating inherent risk with clear and present danger. Why? Okay, so one problem with this reasoning is that he's conflating two things that don't go hand in hand necessarily. So if something, I want to talk about inherent risk here and do a little defining of inherent, because it's a technical term we use in philosophy sometimes. And so if something's inherent to an activity, it's fundamental to, it's necessary to, and ever present in the activity itself. But risk could be inherent without the manifestation of clear and present danger, right? These two things can diverge. So here's an example. Driving in a car is inherently risky, right? So if you're in a car, you're hurtling around at varying speeds, trying to expedite travel and avoid obstacles. This risks physical harm. There's evidence of this, right? The high numbers of automobile-related injuries and death kind of bear out this claim. But there's not a clear and present danger of injury or death every time you get behind the wheel. Clear and present danger isn't inherent to driving. With respect to driving, the activity itself, the risk is inherent, but the danger is merely potential. And it's going to be the specific conditions in a given instance of driving that determine whether and when the danger is going to move from potential to realized. And so if you're driving around, it's a beautiful sunny day at a low speed, there's an inherent risk, but there's not a clear and present danger there. If you're driving around and there's a big storm and there's sheets of rain and wind, there's an inherent risk there as well as clear and present danger. And the different conditions, right, the driving contexts are going to determine whether and when clear and present danger manifests. And it's not present in every act of driving, and so it's not fundamental to the activity itself. So in this same way, we can distinguish between whether an activity is inherently risky from whether it presents a clear and present danger. Okay, so these two things are different and they don't go hand in hand. And so Corbett says, look, there's no clear and present danger, so this activity isn't inherently risky. And I agree, there's no clear and present danger right now. The conditions under which we encounter an extraterrestrial civilization, those will determine whether and when humanity faces a clear and present danger. But we are, of course, as Corbett rightly notes, ignorant, totally ignorant, in fact, of the conditions under which we will, if ever, encounter ETI. So it's true that active searches do not at the moment present a clear and present danger to humanity. But that doesn't mean that they're not inherently risky, right? And so we can come to a kind of intermediate conclusion here that searching for extraterrestrial intelligence can be, it's possible for it to be inherently risky without it presenting a clear and present danger to humanity. And so now let's move on and think, is there good reason to conclude that active searches are inherently riskier than passive searches? So to think through this question, I want to look at a couple of different kinds of consideration. I want to look at what philosophers call teleological considerations, and teleology is the study of kind of goals and causes, what we're aiming for, right? So we're going to look at different aims and goals, and then also at temporal considerations, of course, time related, and I have in mind here specifically contact delays and time for evaluations. Okay, so let's think through this claim or this question of whether active messaging can be inherently risky without clear and present danger by starting off with some teleological considerations. So let's think about what we're aiming for here. Okay, what are we aiming to find? I presume that we're aiming to find all intelligent life, right? Whatever it may be, that's our goal. But we don't necessarily wish to interact with any intelligent life whatsoever. Some intelligent life might not be worth interacting with, right? So in general, we presumably want to interact with beneficial or even benign intelligent life. And we probably want to avoid interacting with hostile or damaging intelligent life. And so I recognize that, you know, cashing it out in these ways just kind of glosses over other possibilities of like mixed features, hostility, benevolence, neutrality, and some combination. And I definitely acknowledge that it's not clear that we would ever be in a good position to understand whether detected intelligent life had any given set of features. We might not be capable of comprehending that. given our limitations. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't still want to evaluate these possibilities to the best of our abilities. And this evaluation is key. And this is where we can bring in some temporal considerations and couple them with a separate set of teleological considerations. So here we have some different teleological considerations brought into bear on the temporal considerations regarding evaluation. So what's the goal of active searches? The goal is to elicit a response, right? By their very nature, they're meant to elicit a reply. And so this means that such messages, they set out to force an interaction with whatever we may find. And it seems like that could compress the time allowed for evaluation or even remove the possibility of evaluation altogether. On the other hand, the goal of passive searches is to recognize signs of intelligent life. By their very nature, they comparatively increase the chances that we may evaluate any intelligent life that we find before committing to an interaction with it. Now, I don't mean to claim that this is a guarantee. Our passive searches could be noticeable, our passive presence may be detectable, but successful passive searches do not guarantee the detection of our presence in the way that successful active searches would. Okay, so here's an analogy to help kind of drive this point home. Let's say you have a video doorbell and somebody rings it. You can check it out, see who they are, evaluate whether they're a threat without their knowing your home. And so contrast this with a scenario where your door is wide open and you're singing, let's say you're singing your favorite Beatles song Across the Universe super loudly and someone shows up. So if that person is a threat, you're in a much more vulnerable position there. You're calling attention to yourself and you're rendering yourself open to potential harm or attack. Okay, so there's an analogy between this kind of time for evaluation and how it relates to potential threats. Now, I want to consider how a METI or an active search proponent could respond to this. And one might reply by extending this analogy even further, right? So an active search proponent might say, hey, if your door is always closed, you could miss opportunities for maybe some pleasant or very useful interactions with your neighbors. And so this loss is a harm insofar as it makes you worse off than you would have been had you opened your door and announced your presence. And so maybe by extension, failing to announce our presence could cause us to miss out on valuable benefits and opportunities that could arise only if others notice we're here. So, okay, both active searches and passive searches raise ethical questions regarding outcomes, right? Is there an outcome of potential threat or is there an outcome of potential benefit? And so both active search critics and active search proponents tend to highlight the potential outcomes that they find most salient. And you see this in the literature. Now, if we're thinking ethically in the philosophical world, ethicists themselves have had a lot to say about the role that outcomes per se play in making appropriate moral determinations. For a long time now, we've been talking about this. But the scope of this kind of ethical theoretical application usually comprises typical predictive scenarios. And in typical predictive scenarios, we're often in a decent or even excellent epistemic position to consider and choose between competing outcomes. So what I mean by epistemic position is like we have some knowledge, we have useful information that informs our deliberation and gives us reason to assign a higher probability to one outcome over another. And so, for example, a new medication might save a lot of lives, or it could fail and cause a lot of harm. And what we can do in typical predictive scenarios is run tests that give us confidence in one outcome over another and then choose the ethically and scientifically appropriate course of action. But we're not similarly epistemically positioned when it comes to deliberating about the outcomes of active search projects. And there are important atypical features in the active search for intelligent life. And these atypical features are actually parallel to another burgeoning technological and biological project that you might not be thinking of if you're thinking about messaging. And so what I want to do here is draw on the work that some others have done in the risk evaluation of the project of synthetic biology and the researchers who aim to create artificial living cells and to take those risk analyses and apply them to the project of searching for intelligent life. So philosophers Marc Baudot and Marc Triant, they focus on the field of synthetic biology and take that kind of set of concerns and combine them and apply them to similar concerns with space exploration, just kind of in general. And we can note that success in both of these endeavors, whether it's synthetic biology or active or passive searches, they'll entail grappling with a new understanding of life in this world. And until the details of these understandings manifest alongside our successes, we're ill-equipped to make predictions about the risks involved. And so what I mean here is that we are engaged in almost, if not pure speculation. And so lots of folks have noted that active messaging involves engaging in new activities, the results of which are largely, if not entirely, opaque to us. I think Catherine Denning calls it a blind alley. Badeau and Triant say that we're deciding in the dark, okay? And so I want to talk about the fact of the matter here, the fact that we're deciding in the dark and what that means for our ethical assessment. Okay, so because the outcomes of synthetic biology projects and of active searches for ETI are kind of excessively difficult to determine, there's just no way to avoid the claim that either could possibly lead to catastrophe, right? So when we're analyzing the risks of synthetic biology or active messaging, we might think, okay, well, here's where these common risk principles might be relevant, in particular, the precautionary principle, right? But Badeau and Triant, they challenge that assumption that these principles are actually going to be useful here. And so we can characterize the precautionary principle in the following way. There's a lot of versions, but let's say the principles suggest do not pursue a course of action that might cause significant harm, even if it's uncertain whether the risk is genuine. And so if this principle were the correct principle to follow, then active messaging would only be permissible when active messaging proponents could provide convincing reasons that messaging will not cause significant harm. But notably, this isn't as simple as testing a new medication, right? The problem with this principle is that it's not well equipped to deal with the complexities that arise specifically when we're deciding in the dark. So when it comes to both the creation of new life forms in the laboratory, which would occur with the success of synthetic biology, or the discovery of intelligent life out in the cosmos, claims about the potential results of these projects are founded on nearly pure speculation, as we've noted. The precautionary principle tells us to avoid projects until they're proven safe enough, but the discovery or creation of new life can't be proven safe enough without the actual work on precisely those projects that the principle requires us to postpone, right? And so this goes for any new technologies that one must first engage with in order to successfully make predictions about. Any time that we're engaging in the project itself is a necessary part of gauging the risk of the project, the principle requires this kind of endless postponement, right? The principle can't permit that activity. So then it seems like the precautionary principle requires the endless postponing of many projects involving new technologies and outcomes, and that this is an undesirable implication. Sometimes we might be justified in moving forward, even when we're deciding in the dark, and some of the more important human breakthroughs have occurred when we're deciding in the dark and moving forward regardless. Okay, so what could justify this move? We don't just want to do it willy-nilly. We want justification for moving forward, even though we're deciding in the dark. So at this point, I'm going to consider two different ways that one could try to justify this move forward. And the two positions I consider in a moment, they're at opposite ends of the contact probability spectrum. So because we're deciding in the dark, we arguably cannot successfully assign probabilities to the proposed outcomes of contact. There's just no way to justifiably suggest that anything is more or less likely than any other outcome. But nonetheless, perhaps we can successfully assign a probability to the proposal that we will make contact with an extraterrestrial civilization through messaging. So here are two potential positions on the probability of contact. And again, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum, more or less. So position one suggests that it's very unlikely that contact will occur. Position two, on the other end, contact is a foregone conclusion. Okay, what's the justification for one? So one could argue for claim one here and say that there's good reason to engage in active messaging in the face of the inherent risks involved, because the likelihood of our making contact is actually extremely low. And they could appeal here to the Fermi paradox that famously highlights the fact that our searches have found no verifiable signs of life in a galaxy that should arguably contain a number of advanced civilizations. So if this silence is evidence of how unlikely it is that we'll make contact with any intelligent life, hey, why not try our hand at messaging? Okay, so what could justify position two here? One could argue for two by noting that active messaging is not the only way that information travels beyond the boundaries of Earth. Not only have humans' relatively weak signals been leaking into space for decades, other stronger transmissions have entered the scene as well. And so the Arecibo Observatory and military radar, they will sometimes send high-powered targeted signals into space, specifically in an attempt to detect near-Earth asteroid trajectories. Now, this is different from the work the researchers have done at the Arecibo Observatory to send messages. This is focused on protecting Earth from asteroid impact. And so here we are, position 2 says, look, we're leaking all these radio signals, and we have been for a long time now, for generations. And there are some actually really high-powered sort of targeted signals being sent out, not for messaging purposes, but for planetary purposes. And so maybe we're just already really noticeable, and so contact is a foregone conclusion. If we've already been unintentionally broadcasting our presence, perhaps active messaging itself adds no new risks. Okay, so these are the two positions that one could appeal to justify that move forward and say, let's pursue active messaging even though we're deciding in the dark. So let's consider each of these positions in turn. Specifically, let's consider responses to these positions in turn. So here's a response to one. Remember, one is the position that it's very unlikely that contact will occur. Let's assume for the sake of argument that this is true. So notably, some potential harmful effects of messaging are nonetheless extremely serious, and that they're bound to be at least global in nature if realized. There's a philosopher, Kelly Smith, who notes that this creates a potential existential threat to Earth. And he states, quote, "We simply can't rule out an existential risk to all of humanity, indeed to all life on Earth. In other words, if there's some chance METI could result in what would literally be, from a terrestrial perspective anyway, the worst possible outcome," end quote. So how should we think about activities that risk such serious consequences, even if only minimally, right? We may not know how probable such harmful consequences are, but we do know the potential is there. There's a non-zero probability of global catastrophe. So one notable consideration here is that there's good evidence that even small risks of very great harm justify constraints and proscriptions on behaviors that allow such risks. So prescriptions are you ought not. So we have prescriptions on murder, right? You ought not murder. So could we justify those? Here's some examples of small risks of great harm justifying constraints and proscriptions. We, I think, generally endorse regulations on, say, child car seat usage or airline safety checks. And it's not because every time you get behind the wheel or take a flight, you're about to die, right? Chances are good that you're not going to get into a crash the next time you maybe drive with your child or get in a plane, but that doesn't justify foregoing the car seat. And I'm pretty sure that most of us would be pretty horrified if our pilot got on before a flight and she said, hey, guess what? We decided to forego all the safety checks. Flying's really safe. We're probably not going to crash. But if you do, these safety measures aren't in place. And I think we'd be horrified. And so these reactions are evidence that risk minimizing behaviors could be required precisely when the potential harm is serious enough, even when it's extremely unlikely that the conditions that lead to the harm will manifest. And so here I have a quote from Smith, who says, even with a risk that's objectively quite low, it might be perfectly rational to refuse to accept it, especially if the negative consequences are sufficiently dire. So even if we assume for the sake of argument that there's a low probability of contact, we may still be morally required to exercise caution. And because the potential harm we're risking is so serious, global, and even intergenerational in nature, perhaps we're justified in prescribing certain behaviors and protocols to those who engage in active messaging and make our presence more noticeable. Okay, so there's a response to claim to position one there. And now I'm going to provide a response to that. Let's think about what an active SETI proponent might claim in response. And to do so, let's look at a reformulation, an active SETI reformulation of position one there. So again, position one, it's extremely unlikely that contact will occur. Perhaps an active search proponent could say, hey, the reason for all this radio silence is that ETI is aware of us, but we're just not that interesting, right? Perhaps making ourselves more noticeable is exactly what's needed to jumpstart communication and then potentially bring about those benefits of contact. And so Douglas Vakoch provides an example of the zoo hypothesis as some justification for saying, hey, maybe we should be louder, because that's what's going to kind of do away with the silence and actually jumpstart some communication. And so the zoo hypothesis, here's a version of it where we think about a human zoo, and let's say we have some zebras in the zoo, and all of a sudden the zebras start stamping out prime numbers. I think we would take note of that. We would think that maybe zebras are a lot more intelligent than we'd given them credit for. And we'd want to start trying to communicate with them in a more concerted and effective way. And so that's the kind of parallel here. Maybe we're just kind of low level in terms of intelligence, according to ETI, who may see us, but who may be silent because they don't think we're capable of communication, and actually shouting out and saying, hey, we're ready to communicate. We're showing off our intelligence. Maybe contact is very unlikely unless we demonstrate our intelligence. And that the METI proponent might say, the good reason to do this is that could then jumpstart the benefits, the potential beneficial outcomes. And one could then, I think, pretty immediately respond to this and compare it to someone who says, hey, but what about the dark forest theory? This comes from the Remembrance of Earth Past series. And it's a 3-book series. I admit I haven't actually read The Dark Forest. I only read The Three-Body Problem. But as far as I understand it, the dark forest theory posits that, like, out of a desire for self-preservation, ETI might be proceeding as silently as possible, but that they're ready to destroy any other intelligent life that they come across, and because that's a threat, right? And they want to preserve their existence. And so by showing off how intelligent we are, that could be the very thing that leads to civilization destruction, global catastrophe. Okay, so now we're kind of down the rabbit hole of responses, challenges, and where we've ended up is in this terrain of what about these potential outcomes? We should do this if the potential outcome of contact is beneficial to us. We should do this other stuff if the potential outcome of contact is global catastrophe. And to kind of bring us all back to where we need to be, I'm gonna highlight another quote from Corbett's that brings in a really important consideration, a really sort of kind of relevant thing to keep in mind, specifically because we're deciding in the dark. So Corbett says here, at first blush, it would appear obvious that the threat of possible destruction, colonization, or conquest by an invading ETI is a worse outcome than simply losing out on a little help from our friends. The problem with that answer is we do not know the solution to either the Fermi paradox or the value of L in the Drake equation, and simply put, the human race's only chance of long-term survival might be a little help from our friends. That's obviously highly speculative, he says, but it's no less speculative and no less probable, or more probable, I'll add, given our current state of knowledge, than the suggestion that ETI may harm us. And so there's a potential risk of global catastrophe if we do contact ETI, but there's also a potential risk of global catastrophe if we don't contact ETI. And since we're deciding in the dark, there's no justifiable reason to assign any one outcome any higher or lower probability than any other. It's all pure speculation at this point. And so here's an overall response to position 1. Outcome-based risk assessment provides us with little to no ethical guidance, specifically because at this time, we're deciding in the dark. We're completely in the dark on these matters. Okay, so that's where we're landing with respect to position 1. Let's move on to an evaluation of position 2. Remember, position 2 says contact is a foregone conclusion. Now, let's consider an important difference between the two kinds of projects we have in mind here when thinking about position 2. So remember, position 2 said, look, it's a foregone conclusion because we have all these folks who are already being pretty loud. Now they're not messaging ETI, but they're being loud, and so we're already noticeable. So let's think about more teleological considerations, or what the aims and goals are, because this is going to make a moral difference. So on the one hand, the aim of the Arecibo Observatory and the researchers there with respect to tracking asteroids, it's to identify another type of potential harm, the harm posed by an asteroid on collision course with Earth, and then to identify that threat early enough to do something about it. And so in this case, if we abstained from increasing our cosmic presence, so if these researchers abstained from tracking asteroids, it would mean that we'd fail to address a specific potential threat, the threat of an impending asteroid. Now, active search proponents, on the other hand, aren't aiming to mitigate any other particular threat. So instead, they're hoping we'll benefit from contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. And risking unrealized potential benefit to humanity from contact with ETI, it's not morally on par with risking the direct and known harm of a humanity-ending asteroid impact. And so something we talk about in ethics is the doctrine of double effect. And this is relevant here. And the doctrine of double effect basically says intended effects can be morally distinct from merely foreseen effects. And so to think about this, think about the fact that the Arecibo Observatory or the US military or any other kind of party is tracking asteroids. This generates two distinct effects, right? It mitigates the threat of an asteroid impact, while at the same time making us more noticeable by sending out high-powered signals. But the former, the mitigating the threat of an asteroid, that's the intended effect. And the latter effect, making us more notable, that's what we call merely foreseen. It's a foreseen side effect of doing the thing we're intending. But active messaging, on the other hand, only achieves one of these effects. It simply makes us more noticeable. And that's both intended and foreseen, right? And so what this means is that the two activities are not morally on par, and available alternatives to each are not analogous, are not ethically analogous. And so the Arecibo Observatory is attempting to mitigate the clear threat of asteroid impact with these activities, while incidentally announcing our presence and risking the potential harm of announcing our presence to ETI without first evaluating them. On the other hand, active search proponents target no particular threat while also intentionally risking the potential harm of announcing our presence to ETI without first evaluating them. And so this difference becomes even more salient when we consider potential available options. If in the future a much quieter means of tracking asteroids became available, we could still achieve the goal of the Arecibo researchers in this scenario, but we couldn't achieve the goal of the active search proponents. So the presence of available options is arguably crucial when we're performing ethical analyses and assessing our moral responsibilities. And such considerations lead to concerns relating to the doctrine of double effect that I just mentioned, but they also lead to the following ethical observation. What you're permitted to do when there are no good alternatives, it can be far different from what you're permitted to do when there are multiple similar options to consider. So here's an example. Performing life-saving surgery without anesthesia before the invention of anesthesia was, all else equal, clearly morally permissible, despite the pain that the patient would experience. But performing life-saving surgery right now without anesthesia when anesthesia is readily available is clearly morally impermissible, all else equal, because of the gratuitous pain it would cause. So options matter morally. And now notably, when we're thinking through potential outcomes of active and passive searches and contact with ETI, we're wholly ignorant of the content of those outcomes. We simply don't know, and we don't have any information that could allow us to assign higher or lower probabilities to different outcomes. We're returning to this position of ignorance, but even from this position of ignorance, we can consider what the available options are with respect to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And so here, I would like to note a kind of important divergence between the aforementioned activity of synthetic biology and of searching for ETI. So notably, the alternative to engaging in synthetic biology products that aim to synthesize new life is kind of just to abandon those synthetic biology projects. Researchers don't have any other options. They can either engage in this project, see what happens, or just abandon it. And we don't get to find out whether we can kind of create these maybe cells or organisms with utterly unique genetic codons, right? But that's not the same case for active searches. The alternative to METI and to current active searches for extraterrestrial intelligence, it's not to abandon the search for ETI, but the alternative is passive searches. So let's compare the two and see how they stack up ethically. Here we have passive searches, and they allow us to proceed with the search for intelligent life. Active searches also allow us to proceed with the search for intelligent life. Passive searches allow us to continue to pursue the potential benefits of interaction with ETI, because after detecting ETI, we could choose to try to interact with them. Active searches also allow us to continue to pursue the potential benefits of interaction with ETI. But Here we have a notable difference. Passive searches are inherently less risky precisely because they allow for the possibility of that time for evaluation of the nature of ETI before engaging in interaction, whereas active searches are inherently riskier, as we noted, precisely because they kind of remove that possibility of allowing the time for evaluation of the nature of ETI. So when we're deciding in the dark, I claim that, well, actually, I want to add, this doesn't mean that the inherent riskiness of active messaging must render the activity completely morally forbidden. That's not where I think we should land, in part because it's not the case that risky behavior must always be forbidden, right? We still drive our children around in their car seats, we still fly in planes, we use new medications, we engage in scientific projects, the effects of which have not been fully determined, and we could actually ethically and collectively choose to take on the inherent risks of active messaging. But how we arrive at this decision matters, morally, of course. And so I think that we need to keep these following things in mind when deciding between active and passive searches. Because we're deciding in the dark, ethical confidence is in short supply. We don't get the kind of confidence we do in typical predictive scenarios where we can assign probabilities to various outcomes and do the thing we're kind of most justified in thinking will occur. And so the importance of our ethical deliberation kind of increases inversely as the ethical confidence decreases. And what we need to do then is ensure that we engage in careful ethical deliberation precisely because we don't get that ethical confidence from assigning probabilities to different outcomes. And so considerations of inherent risk can actually provide us with some important ethical guidance here. And it's just notable that available options matter morally. And so there's a lot that we don't know, but there are some key things that we do know. And so what I want to conclude just very, very basically is this. There's a risk-based ethical asymmetry between active and passive searches. Now, it's not based on like outcome-based risk assessment. It's a risk-based ethical asymmetry based on inherent risk assessments. And so from this basic conclusion, if we unpack it, what we have are the following take-home points. So the take-home points are that outcome-based risk assessment, it currently has little to no role in the debate about which mode of search is ethically advisable. It's a really interesting project, I think. And there's a lot of interesting and creative things people have said, kind of speculating about what the outcomes of searches and contact might be. But at the end of the day, we don't get to assign any higher or lower probabilities to any of these kind of creative outcomes. And so it's not going to provide us with much ethical guidance. Now, I don't want to suggest that this means that outcome-based risk assessment is actually irrelevant ethically. I think it's a really great thing to do. I think it could be really useful in helping us to prepare us to better evaluate the nature of ETI if and when we actually do detect ETI. So it doesn't mean we should stop kind of speculating and thinking about these potential outcomes, but it's not actually going to provide us with any useful justifications for thinking through the question of active searches versus passive searches. The second take-home point is that it's the assessment of inherent risks that's actually really relevant to the debate about which mode of search is ethically advisable. And this is because our ability to evaluate the nature of detected ETI prior to interaction, it's highly ethically relevant, and it generates the aforementioned ethical asymmetry between active and passive searches. And so what I've shown is that the debate about active versus passive messaging, it actually just needs to center on the following question. To what extent are we obligated to increase the possibility that we may evaluate the nature of ETI before announcing our presence to ETI? And I think this is the crux of the issue. This is where we should be focusing our ethical deliberation when deliberating between active and passive searches. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, of course.
Thank you so much. Chelsea, 1 second. That was awesome. Thanks for laying out the arguments. Cases. I'm going to open up the floor. We have about 10 minutes for discussion or questions. I see that there was one question in the chat. I'm not sure if Chelsea, I think, maybe went over it, but I see some hands being raised. Let's see.
So was in the question in the chat, did my talk address that?
Martin asks, what about the risks associated with not going ahead? And Martin asked that kind of early on before you got to that section. But if you wanted to touch on that again.
Oh yeah, so, you know, sort of equally important and equally unable to assign probabilities to the risks. So that's a decide in the dark. Setting that aside just doesn't provide us with ethical guidance. Could provide us, of course, with some useful speculation for informing our deliberations should we encounter ETI and decide to engage in interaction.
Right, and I see 3 hands raised, which is exciting. 4 hands raised, wow. I've not used the hands raised thing, so I'm gonna go in the order that it shows up on my screen. So I'm going to ask Rebecca, let's see, to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Excellent. First of all, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. It was very thought-provoking. So what I'm curious about is, so you were focusing primarily on the risk inherent in either passive or active searches, but I wonder if you or any other philosopher have also looked at the ethics of the content of the message and who controls that message. I'm a historian of science, and I've as part of a paper I'm writing right now, looking a little bit into the pioneer plaques, which you could argue is a form of METI. Are you familiar with the pioneer plaques?
Is that on the Voyagers?
No, on the Pioneer missions. They're the ones that have the picture of the man and the woman, and then there's the pulsar map.
The more recent?
It was in the 70s, I believe.
Okay, so, okay, yeah.
Well, essentially, with those plaques, at the time, historically, there was a lot of outcry against them from the feminist community was unhappy with how women were portrayed. Christians were unhappy that there were nude images of human beings being sent out into the galaxy. So there was a lot of pushback from the global community on that presentation. So I wonder if this is also in the purview of philosophers looking at the content of the message and how you could possibly represent all human cultures from maybe all spans of time, right? Because Earth culture now may not be Earth culture when the message is received, etc.
For sure,
so
yeah.
I'd be curious about your thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you, yeah. So quick answer is philosophers should. That's definitely the kind of thing that is ripe for philosophical analysis. I'm not aware of any philosophers who have thought a lot about this. There's actually not a lot of work that's been done in space ethics. But in fact, Julie and I actually have an article from 2019 where we talk a little bit about the content of the message and comprehensibility and what we might kind of owe to humanity in terms of getting some consensus on what the content is, as well as some ideas about how to make sure it's comprehensible to non-humans, intelligent life that's not human. And so what that is kind of like several steps down the road of, so that question that I left you all with, so whatever the answer to that is, if it involves communicating at some point, then that raises a very, very important related question of what should that communication entail, and that raises very important ethical concerns as well as just sort of logistical or comprehensibility concerns. And so there's a lot to be said about that. And I don't think we have to wait until we kind of answer the question of communication before we start thinking carefully about what messages should involve the content, especially because they're already going out. But that is, I think, a really important kind of question about that definitely relates to not just philosophy but to ethics. And as far as I know, not a lot of philosophical ink has been spilled on that question, but Julie and I have waved our hands at some ideas of important things to keep in mind, and I think that's an area kind of ripe for further philosophical analysis. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, we got about 6 minutes and I have a few more hands raised. I'm going to ask Jason to unmute.
All right. I'm just curious, this is a great talk. I really enjoyed your whole analysis. I'm curious about leakage. There have been suggestions that maybe the right way to do METI is not to send out new broadcasts, but to, and I wish I could find this paper, embed hello, we're here messages in the stuff we're already sending out, inviting contact on the theory that they already know we're here, but we haven't invited them in yet, and that's the reason. And so that doesn't increase the likelihood of being noticed, but it does invite a response. So that's kind of a corner case. And then I'm also just quickly interested in, if we regulate METI, do we have to regulate everything, or is there something different about METI broadcasts because they're intentional that give them special treatment?
Yeah, so the example you give, it's super interesting because it's sort of this tandem kind of, well, there's already this leakage. What if we, we're not doing anything new. It's already just as detectable as it ever was. We're just including messages in it. So there's notably still a kind of difference in intentions there. And so the doctrine of double effect, we can bring that in and use it to at least think through that question ethically. And so there, we're building in intentional transmission, right? Even though it's not any longer distinct from a different project, right? It's part and parcel with this project we're already doing, but we still have the intentions, and those intentions matter morally. And that doesn't make them kind of morally forbidden, but it does mean they're relevant, and we should weigh those considerations and think about whether we're justified in taking the risks that are involved, right? And so it's not a new risk in terms of generating contact, because it's the kind of level of leakage is already happening, but it could be a risk, going back to the previous question of what we include in the message and then how it's interpreted, right? So we still might want to take some time to evaluate before we start directly communicating, to make sure we're saying things in the best way possible. And we haven't evaluated any ETI, and so we'll be putting messages in pre-evaluation, and that seems inherently riskier than putting messages in post-evaluation. And so that, I think, would be ethically relevant there. But that's a great question, thanks. Oh, and then with respect to regulating METI, I didn't touch on that too much at all. I think that's a whole can of worms, and I think you could kind of slippery slope into now we just have to regulate everything. But I definitely do think there are really important ethical considerations that come with kind of making sure we take seriously the fact that the potential results of messaging and of contact, however it arises, they're affecting, whether it's benefits or harms, they affect humanity, right? And to take that very seriously and to take it into ethical consideration. Thanks.
All right, so we have 2 more hands raised, and then some notes from a question from Catherine Denning in the chat, and another comment. So I'm going to go ahead and ask William to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, I was interested in your account of, good talk by the way, thank you, your account of the zoo hypothesis, which I thought was potentially incomplete, because with all the focus these days on looking for technosignatures, we could perhaps have a reasonable assumption that we are on Earth already known about by ETIs elsewhere. The zoo hypothesis assumes we're uninteresting, but that's not the only way of interpreting the fact that we are known. It could be that, for example, an extraterrestrial is waiting for evidence that we can do things like explode atomic bombs or build rockets and all the rest of it. It's not that they're uninterested, it's that the passage of time means that we couldn't meet some criteria, whatever they set up for intelligence, without us doing anything at all. We don't have to. We're already known. We're already being studied. How does that impact your ethical spectrum?
So what that kind of builds in is considerations of potential outcomes and whether we want to risk kind of foregoing the benefits of proving ourselves intelligent enough or capable enough of various things. And so however you want to cash out the zoo hypothesis, it's still an outcome-based risk assessment. It's still focused on what we could stand to gain or benefit from getting ETI that already knows we're here to interact with us. And we just don't have enough information, really any, to assign a probability to that being the case. And in fact, the zoo hypothesis is perfectly consistent with the state of affairs right now. Utter silence, right? But maybe our best evidence says if we're deciding to move forward on the assumption that the zoo hypothesis was true, or on the assumption that folks don't know we're here yet, then we'd want something to help guide to help us choose between those two. And I guess I'm not sure of what could tip the scales in favor of assuming we're being observed silently. And so if we have to choose between those two, and there's some reason to favor the assumption that all this silence means we're not being observed, then the rest of the argument that I provided still stands, and outcome-based assessments aren't going to provide us with ethical guidance. Of course, if we discover we're being observed, it changes everything. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. I'm going to quickly move on. We are past time, and I know there's a few meetings happening right now, so I want to honor those, but I'm going to ask Anna to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I was just curious about how or whether we weigh ethically the fact that humans are not the only life on Earth, and obviously, presumably, we're the only ones making this decision, and whether that's something that's thought about or how that's thought about, I guess.
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Sorry. I was just curious about how or whether we sort of ethically weigh the fact that humans are not the only life on Earth, but presumably we're the only ones whose opinions we're taking into account when we, weigh the pros and cons of this sort of decision. And so how ethically we consider the potential risks or benefits to life on Earth as opposed to humans on Earth.
No, that's a great question. So a lot of the debate kind of focuses on like humanity ending kind of catastrophes and how worrisome this is for humans, and that may be a bit speciesist, right? The risks aren't just to humans, the risks could be to the entire planet, all sorts of species, ecosystems, things like that. And so what that means is that there's even more ethically at stake than is typically kind of brought up in debates. And it doesn't mean that those morally relevant kind of questions, it doesn't mean they're irrelevant, right? It just means I think they're less commonly discussed. But I think you're absolutely right that if we're going to do a complete ethical analysis, we don't want to just talk about what happens to humans. We want to think about what happens to everything that deserves our moral consideration. And at this point in ethical study, ethical, what we call moral considerability, that which deserves our moral consideration, we think that extends well beyond just the species human, and extends into animals, non-human animals, environments, and ecosystems. And so all of that is definitely, I think, relevant when we start thinking through what we ought to be considering and who we owe maybe some kind of a deliberation for. Yeah, thank you.
Great questions. I just wanted to acknowledge Catherine's question. Thanks. Catherine says, thanks so much, Chelsea. Crystal clear and useful as always. Could you say some more about your own answer to the question on your final slide?
So to what extent ought we, yeah, so my official answer is that that's the question we should be focusing on, and that's what we have the most kind of reason to move forward and try to find an answer to, and we can kind of set aside a lot of the other stuff. I don't have a fully worked out answer to it, but kind of knee-jerk gut level sort of reaction is that evaluating things are evaluating something that we are unaware of. Once we become aware of it, I like to find out, I like to find things out. I like to know before acting. And so I feel like there's probably a lot of folks who might kind of have that same motivation. There are probably lots of others who think, well, hey, there's plenty of other relevant factors to consider. And so my knee jerk is to be kind of like, evaluation matters. And it's it's a valuable thing to be able to do. And removing that possibility is a little concerning. But again, I don't think that means it's automatically prohibited. But I tend to think that evaluation is a really valuable sort of tool. Yeah. Thank you, Catherine.
I was muted. Catherine had posted a recent article called SETI and Democracy, which looks interesting, and I just copied it. Let's see. All right. We are 5 past noon California time, Pacific time. Are there any final questions before we thank our speaker and end the meeting?
Any I didn't get to, I'm available via email. Definitely feel free to get in contact with me. And I'm definitely happy to chat more about this with anybody whose questions I didn't get to.
Well, great. Bella and I thank you very much for taking time out of your busy world to speak with our group about this important topic that's very relevant to SETI. So thank you.
Thank you, Bella.
All right. Well, take care, everyone, and I'll announce the next monthly meeting and guest speaker and all of that good stuff. And stay safe, stay vigilant, wash your hands, wear a mask.
Thanks.
Live long, please. All right. Bye, everyone.